BC Hydro recently released its 2021 Integrated Resource Plan out to 2041. And it is a very interesting document indeed. And I'm going to talk to Dan Woynillowicz, who is a clean energy and clean technology consultant with Polaris Strategy, about it. Welcome to the interview, Dan.
Great to be here.
Now, Dan, I have views on this particular document, but I'm very curious to know what yours are. So can you give us an overview, please?
Sure. I mean, I guess right off the top, just to say there's been a lot of anticipation from all quarters for this integrated resource plan from BC Hydro because it's been delayed several times. And so it's been years since we've had one. We haven't had one since we've had this the NDP government here in Victoria. So a lot of anticipation, particularly in terms of how is it going to set us up to succeed from a climate mitigation perspective? Is it really going to help us reduce emissions? So a lot of anticipation for it. So they've now released the draft. And I guess, my top line comment on it would be, unfortunately, this draft is a resource plan designed for the 20th century that isn't fit for purpose for the challenges we have in the 21st century.
Yeah, I can see that. This is all of the trends that are apparent. And, I interview experts all around the world about electricity systems and the electrification of the economy through climate policy, the technologies that are transforming power grids and electrical utilities and distributed energy resources, on and on and on. All of these trends are literally, it's a revolution in the electricity system. And I look at this document and I go, none of them are reflected in there. I have no explanation for it, but do you have any insights into why that might be?
Well, I think in part it's because BC Hydro has still been dealing with policy uncertainty. So the government has legislated greenhouse gas reduction targets and expect that electrification is going to be a central element of how we cut pollution by fuel switching from fossil fuels to our clean electricity. But we don't yet have, other than for electric vehicles, where there are legislated targets for percentage of sales of electric vehicles over the next 20 years. For example, with buildings or industrial electrification, there isn't a lot of policy clarity yet. And consequently, BC Hydro has been very conservative and said, okay, well, absent clear policy regulations in place, we're not going to try to prescribe how much electrification is going to happen. So they're being a little bit more reactive. Consequently, in their base resource plan, BC doesn't achieve its greenhouse gas reduction targets. They've developed a contingency scenario called the accelerated scenario, in which BC achieves its targets. And in that scenario, it's a radically different story. In the base resource scenario, we've got surplus capacity basically for the next decade. But in the accelerated scenario, where we're electrifying more, we're doing what we need to do to address climate change, we actually face a deficit, both in terms of electricity capacity and the total amount of electricity that we can produce in a year within the next several years. So radically different scenarios, only one of which is consistent with hitting our climate change targets. And unfortunately, that's not the main scenario that BC Hydro is currently putting forward, saying, this is what we're going to plan for.
For our viewers' sake, I want to give it a little bit of background. So there have been some studies produced. University of Victoria released a study last year that showed if BC electrified all of its transportation out to 2045, it would require twice the electricity it currently generates. Jay Mather for the Clean Energy BC Clean Energy Association did a study on industry, and it found that twice the electricity that currently is generated will be needed by 2040. So that's already 3 times what we need by 2040 to do industry and transportation, and that doesn't even include buildings. So that'll give you some idea of the magnitude of what other studies have shown would be required. Dan, I guess, how do you respond to that?
I think certainly when we're looking at over the next 20 years, the next 30 years, if we're talking about achieving net zero emissions by 2050, we will need probably at least double, if not more, electricity relative to what we have today. Now, There are lots of other technologies on the demand side, whether we're talking about energy efficiency, so we can be using electricity much more efficiently, and so that can reduce the need for new generation or new capacity. And similar, we can do things like load shifting, peak shifting. So for example, if people who own electric cars are charging them overnight rather than right when they get home from work, it doesn't have the same kind of an impact on the electricity system. But nonetheless, we are going to require significantly more electricity. Again, even the difference between the base scenario that BC Hydro is planning for versus their accelerated scenario. In the accelerated scenario, by 2030, we would need about 30% more power, in the next 10 years, and that needs to be planned for. It needs to be permitted. It's not necessarily, BC Hydro acknowledges it's not necessarily going to be all delivered by BC Hydro, so they would be going back to the marketplace and looking for private renewable energy developers to develop that power. And that takes time to develop relationships with communities, to do all of the siting and permitting. So again, I think we need BC Hydro planning today for how BC is going to be achieving its greenhouse gas reduction targets and maximizing the advantage BC has because of our clean electricity grid. And unfortunately, that's not the core scenario that BC Hydro is currently planning for.
I want to sketch a scenario here and get your response to it. So every other jurisdiction, or almost every other jurisdiction in North America, is looking at moving from that old vertically integrated cost of service model, utility model that we see with BC Hydro, and moving to a flat horizontal sort of a distributed energy platform. Where it's a collection of grids, collection of microgrids, and producers, there's generators, and consumers can generate, and they can trade services, and it's very much a dynamic, market-oriented kind of system. And I look at the BC plan, and BC Hydro envisions itself exactly as it has been for the last 60 years. Its role essentially, hasn't changed an iota in the face of an industry that's changing tremendously. Well, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, to the comment that I made off the top, in terms of this does look more like not only a plan, but a utility that's built for the 20th century, not the 21st century. And we see people want a lot more choice. They want a lot more, at times, even control over their own ability to produce power with solar. And with the rate at which rooftop solar panels are dropping in price, more and more people are going to want to do that. In other jurisdictions, we see utilities encouraging that and adapting their business models so that they can still be successful and profitable in that type of a situation. Here in BC, not only have we not had BC Hydro encouraging that, in fact, to a certain degree, they're discouraging it. So I think that we do risk a situation in which we have people beginning to try to defect from the grid by adopting their own rooftop solar, their own batteries in their garages, or integrating it with their electric vehicle. BC Hydro doesn't appear to be ready for that. They don't really appear to be thinking through what's their role in that type of an evolution.
Yeah, another good point. I mean, all you have to do is look at what's driving the change in other jurisdictions, and this includes Alberta, I might add. And a lot of it has to do with big customers saying, why should I pay the utility for that when I can generate my own power? And it's the defection of big customers that is changing the utility behavior, because then they lose that revenue, and they have to spread the costs of their grid and other services around the other customers, residential customers, small business customers. So BC Hydro seems to think that it's insulated from all of those. But here's a question for you, Dan, and that is, if BC Hydro isn't taking the lead in responding to these larger changes that are taking place, and the BC government there appears to be a vacuum in terms of policy leadership, where is leadership going to come from to prompt the changes that need to be made in BC's electricity system?
Well, I think that the disruption very well could come both from residential customers who increasingly might shift towards solar if they think that that's a better value proposition for where they live and how they consume power. And then similarly on the industrial side, I think the other real gap with this planning document from BC Hydro is there's no mention of green hydrogen. The BC government has been working on a hydrogen strategy for quite some time now. It keeps getting delayed in terms of its release. So I think perhaps that's one of the reasons why BC Hydro hasn't factored that in. But the production of green hydrogen using electricity to produce hydrogen could be a significant new load opportunity for BC Hydro. And again, the more load they have, the more electricity they're selling, that's good for all ratepayers. If they're not able to sell all of the power that they can produce, that means rates are higher for everybody. But no expectation, at least that they've stated within this planning document, about the production of green hydrogen. Again, so what we might see then are green, if somebody wants to begin producing green hydrogen, they may build their own power generation. They may link up to their own wind farm for producing green hydrogen, and then that's a missed opportunity for BC Hydro. But if BC Hydro is not planning for it, then I think those opportunities will come from the private sector. They'll figure out still how to do it.
This is a related question, and maybe we'll wrap up the interview with this, Dan. There's been a fair amount of talk, and this has gone on for years, but I think it's intensifying now, and it's around the east-west flow of electricity. In this, most of the electricity that's traded across borders in Canada is north-south. But Western Canada is in a unique position because it has Alberta and Saskatchewan in the middle that have tremendous wind and solar resources. It has Manitoba and British Columbia on the end that have tremendous hydro resources, which act as batteries basically for renewables. And I don't know how many economists I've talked to who said, somehow if you knit those four systems together, it would make integrating clean energy renewables so much more efficient and effective. There's no hint of that in BC Hydro's document, and nor do you see any movement from the BC government to talk about this one, in fairness, neither from the other three governments in the other three provinces. This seems to be a tremendous missed opportunity.
I agree 100%. We don't see that reflected, again, in part because I think there hasn't been a political signal that that's a priority. And unfortunately, it's been somewhat of an intractable issue between BC and Alberta at the political level. But certainly, if we're thinking about how do we optimize our power grids for ratepayers in terms of keeping costs down, to reduce emissions as cost effectively as possible, and to be able to attract new businesses, new load, new industrial activity that requires clean electricity, then we absolutely should be looking at how can we better integrate grids across these provinces in Western Canada. And the reality is, if we look at what happened to Texas this past winter, when you have a grid that's an island unto itself, you do not have the energy security that you do relative to if you are connected into other grids. And so in an era of climate change where we are also going to be seeing more wildfires, more storms, where we might have outages, where lines go down and we don't have access to certain generating facilities, then having that security of being integrated with other grids, that also offers us energy security. And so that's also something that I don't think is adequately reflected in this plan.
And we're a few days away from forecast in Vernon, 28 degrees Celsius. And so we might, in British Columbia, maybe shouldn't be as smug about what happens in Texas and California during their hot weather, because it appears that, we may be in for some of that ourselves, and with the problems perhaps that you just mentioned. Well, thank you very much for this, Dan. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks, Markham.